You're listening to the Savvy Painter Podcast, episode number 37.
Welcome to the Savvy Painter Podcast, the podcast for artists who mean business. Here's your host, Antrese Wood.
Hello, it's Antrese, and welcome to another episode of the Savvy Painter Podcast. I am really excited to have Mitchell Johnson on the show with me today. If you are as obsessive about color theory as I am, this is the episode for you. We're going to talk about the role of color in his work and how it enables him to move seamlessly between abstraction and representation. Joseph Albers, Johann Zitten, and Giorgio Morandi have heavily influenced his work, and he's going to tell you how. We also dig into the business side. Mitchell is convinced that there's an audience for your work, but it's your responsibility to go find them. We talk about some of the maverick techniques he used to get his work in front of the right people. Mitchell's paintings have been acquired by the Kemper Art Museum in Kansas City and the Ogunquit Museum of Art in Maine. His work has also appeared in a mountain of publications, including Art in America, The New York Times, American Artist, Huffington Post, and the list goes on and on and on. It's a pleasure and an honor to have Mitchell Johnson as my guest today. Mitchell, welcome to the podcast, and thank you so much for making the time to be here.
Hi, Antrese. Thanks for inviting me.
So not many artists, I think, mix representational and abstract painting simultaneously like you do. And it seems to confuse people because I think sometimes people are more comfortable when they can label an artist or put them in a box. And I recently read this article by John Seed in the Huffington Post. And if you don't mind, I'd like to read a quote from that article because I thought it was really interesting. Okay. You said, "It's all about investigating color and how it always fools us. I never plan series or bodies of work or think about style and content." So what have you learned by investigating color for so long that keeps you intrigued?
Well, when John wrote that article, that was during a show I had in Oakland a couple of years ago, and that show had a bunch of landscapes with these large patterns of color on top of them, like patches or blocks of color. And so it was a little bit different from when I had just been painting landscapes that were clearly distilled or abstracted, and then making, more kind of pure abstract paintings, because I was kind of combining the two. And it was interesting how you would get to a point in these landscapes that the color didn't seem like it could move so much, but I wanted it to move. And so I was changing the colors by introducing other colors, if that makes sense. So you're changing them indirectly, basically, by adding something. And I had done that off and on, but I hadn't really had a full body of work. And so the show in Oakland was kind of new because it was a sort of a complete body of work where all these paintings were kind of about the same approach, I guess. But one thing I want to make clear is that the approach was, it was very intuitive. It wasn't so much that I thought, oh, this is, something that's kind of interesting. And I made two of them. And I thought, wow, I need to really make a series. I think that was really important, what he mentioned in the article, that I don't really think about, okay, here's 2 paintings, 3 paintings that are really working. And now I need to come up with 15, so I can have a show. I need a full body that really proves, how much I wanted to explore this. I work on a massive abstract painting in the morning in the studio, and then I might make a small painting of a very bucolic, scene in Sweden or something in the same day, which I think is very hard for people to understand or even just kind of believe that I work that way. But that's just intuitively how I work. So that big abstract painting that might have been going on for 2 years is negotiated the same way as that small bucolic painting from Sweden that could be based on another painting, or it could be coming from a drawing or a photograph or a memory. Because if the color is doing something that engages me and is special, then it's really the same to me, whether it's a big expanse of yellow in an abstract painting or whether it's a small expanse of yellow in a field and something, very literal. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. I think what's kind of interesting is like you're saying, that bouncing back between the two, the big body of work and then the small bucolic painting, as you're saying. And what I was thinking about when you're saying, when that quote of you investigating color and not really going for the series, it seems like that colors, it can be abstract in pushing different colors by not moving that color, but by moving what's around it, which is very much, I would guess, influenced by Joseph Albers. So that makes sense to me that you would go back and forth between the representational and abstract, because it is about the color. I don't know if that makes sense anymore.
Yeah, no, well, I guess all the paintings are basically the same thing for me, as different as they might be to other people, in the sense that some of them have literal or that they have imagery. And I understand that somebody might identify a house or the sun or the sea or a field in a painting, and then this other painting is so abstracted or distilled that it's simply the shapes and the colors, and they can't fully attach themselves to any kind of idea of recognizing something in it. And so because of that difference in the way that they would approach something that has recognizable items and something that doesn't, I imagine the color means something different to them in one painting versus in another. And yet, when I'm making it, the color is either pulling me in and doing something special, or it's not. It's either working and it's holding together and it feels like a complete thought or like a finished journey, or it doesn't. So if it's not working, or if it doesn't feel finished, then it's really the same problem in either painting, to try to figure out where is that point. And I think that for most people to try to understand my work, if you can think about Joseph Albers and Giorgio Morandi at the same time, I think you start to get a sense of what I'm doing, because it really, almost all of the more recent work of the last 10 years goes back to when I saw a Albers show in the Morandi Museum when I was in Bologna in Italy. I always go to see Morandi. I go to Italy usually once or twice a year, and I always go to the Morandi Museum. And I was very surprised to walk in and find an Albers show back in 2005. But they hadn't taken all of the Morandi paintings away in order to put up the Albers show. The paintings were being shown side by side. And I had seen both of them, many times, but I'd never thought about them in the same moment. And that was a watershed experience to see them together, because there was something about, not like you just take the two of them and put them in a blender and then you get this new recipe.
Right.
But seeing them together was very much, I was in this moment where my work was transitioning, and they had this massive clue for me about what I wanted to transition into.
Right.
So, I mean, really, literally, like you're walking in and somebody's saying, hey, that thing you're working on and it's going pretty well, but you're still a little stuck. And it really was like this huge push, almost like a whisper of, you should do that, you're doing that and you're kind of thinking you should keep going. And yes, you really should keep going, Does that make sense?
That makes absolute sense to me, because I think that's just how our mind works in a way. If you're really trying hard to solve a problem, your mind is, for example, you're in the studio and you're really thinking about this idea that you have or this direction that you want to go in. And your mind is just looking for every single clue or every single way to solve that problem. And I think most solutions come in art, in science, in everything, when you have that complete dedication and that complete focus, and then you walk away and you're not consciously thinking about it, but in the back of your mind is still trying to solve that problem. And when you're not consciously thinking about it, you're more able to take two things that seem completely unrelated and connect the dots.
Yeah, and it's also that you're trying to find kind of a full body solution, because you're working on it partly with your head, with your brain, you're working on it with your heart. And I think that when the paintings come together, it feels like your entire body's convinced that they are working, or that they're a complete thought or a complete statement. And let me tell you something else that might help you to understand what I'm trying to get at. I used to paint outside in Italy. I would take, this French easel and set up and put a hat on to try not to get sunburned, and stand out there for hours and make paintings that a lot of people loved and bought, because they're these beautiful paintings of Italy and things that people, recognize and want to have in their house. But they were so much about these little pieces of color sitting next to each other and doing something. They were, for me, they were about the same thing as these massive abstract paintings that I make, but yet they were so representational that everyone else was engaging with them in a different way, which was totally fine. So the point of the story is there I am painting, this typical Tuscan farmhouse and cypresses. And every now and then these contadini, these farmers would go by in their trailer or their tractor, and I would get this big, massive piece of blue traveling right in front of me, or an orange trailer. And it happened several times. So one time it happened, and I just suddenly stuck this really abstracted tractor and trailer, this blue tractor and this orange trailer, into the front of one of the landscapes. And the introduction of these very strong colors that were not appearing in the painting otherwise seemed to really impact, or it didn't seem to, it did really impact what was going on with that sort of grayish soil, and then that tan house, and that greenish field, and then that dark, weird, bluish-green cypress. And I thought it is so much more about what I'm really seeing, or what I'm really getting excited about. And then a friend of mine a few years later had all of these mazzette, like color decks of the enamels that they used to paint the tractors and the cars.
Okay.
And so this friend of mine who had like an old body shop gave me all these stacks of these old amazing colors of old Fiats from the 70s, and like the colors they used to retouch, like an Ape or a Piaggio Vespa.
Right.
And so I was physically holding all of these man-made colors in this color deck, and then standing there in a field making this outdoor painting with all of these man-made colors in my hand. And I started to actually make exact copies of the color in the deck, which are very different, from what comes out of a tube.
Right.
And I started to introduce those Italian car colors or enamels into some of these landscapes. And it was fascinating, this play between the sort of man-made colors and then the naturally occurring, field and dirt and things like that. So that was happening. And then I'm seeing this Albers Morandi show, which was kind of continuing that same conversation of these man-made colors versus observed color in nature, because that's partly what Albers is very much pulling off of, kind of a color gamut that really, comes from all of these colors that existed because of car manufacturing and things like that. And anyway, I don't want to be too heady about it. Like I didn't investigate it quite so intellectually. It was a very intuitive thing. It was a very gut thing, that here was this whole story of color. And then it was amazing how different, this color of this orange tractor was on my palette.
Yeah.
And then how different it was from the palette into the painting.
Right.
And so this all pushed me into this really, really intensive research where I compared the famous Art of Color by Johannes Itten with Joseph Albers' book, The Interaction of Color. And so I did this very, very long-term investigation of these two books and what they meant to each other, because those guys are not friends. You can't think about like anybody who loves color as being necessarily compatriots or something. They were very different people. They were not. Albers did not like Itten, and his whole book, Interaction of Color, is like speaking back against the Itten book.
Right.
There's so many people that use these books and probably don't have any idea about the competition between these guys.
I had no idea about that competition.
Yeah.
That's
so anyway, we're really kind of we're just kind of like spinning through this lengthy response to your question, but I got invited to have a residency at the Albers Foundation in Connecticut. And while I was there, part of what I did was I investigated the relationship between the Albers book and the Itten book, which strangely enough, they had a signed copy of in their library, and they didn't even know about it. And it sort of proved that this whole, because the Interaction of Color comes out right on the heels of Itten's book and was very much a response, as you can see, because of the dates they're published and so on. Anyway, now you know how much color work matters to me.
Yeah.
And that it is such a complex experience. And the only thing I could hope is that when people look at my paintings is that maybe they're drawn in by something that they respond to because my painting is from Cape Cod or it's from Tuscany. But the real story in the painting is how much credit have you given to your visual experience? How much do you pay attention to it? Isn't it far more special, far more complex than maybe you've begun to realize? So I think they get started for one reason, and then hopefully their involvement with the painting of mine that goes on their wall leads to a much more rich experience than maybe they expected.
Yeah.
So
Fascinating. As somebody who paints outside, who does plein air painting as well, I still have this. I can really appreciate what you said about standing there painting, and then all of a sudden this, when you're that focused, it's really a flash of color goes by, and for me at least, it would be a flash of color, and then that's a truck.
Right.
Right. So is that sort of the breakup of, you have these series of paintings where there's, maybe houses or scenes, and there's these specifically square blocks of color on top of it. And I can't help but think of the trucks passing by, and I don't know if that's absolutely too literal.
They're definitely connected. I don't know if... It's funny telling you the story right now because I really hadn't actually thought about it for quite a while. And I was in the studio a couple of days ago, and I have this painting from Cape Cod, and I masked in these big areas of color on the top of the composition, and I hadn't made the composition thinking that I would ever end up doing that. So I don't think it comes precisely from that experience that I'm talking about, which, and when that was happening, that was back in 95. I don't know, what is that, almost 20 years ago. And I like the way the color on the surface interrupts things and maybe challenges people. I like that the patches of the color on the surface remind people that the painting's fiction. Mm-hmm. And that I'm not by any means trying to convince you that, wow, look at how well he can draw and paint a chair or a person or the water. It's not at all about some attempt to show my chops or to be so good at something that I can trick you or fool you. I mean, I want you to be, I don't want you to forget that the painting is fiction. You know how Bonnard would always put a little figure or a cat like at the very bottom of the composition, somewhere very flat in a corner or down in the front. And it's the kind of thing that a lot of the time you don't see it until you really look carefully, or you make a drawing from his painting and then which pushes you out to the edges, and then you find that cat. But those cats or those people that he parks down in these weird moments in the bottom of the composition are, I think those are his acknowledgement that he's like tapping you on the shoulder and saying, hey, just let's not get carried away here. This is a two-dimensional surface. This is fiction. Don't forget that this is about kind of my visual experience of the world. This isn't about me, illustrating something for you. Mm-hmm. This is about me compiling my visual experience. And then the painting is therefore a reminder that you are doing the same thing, that you go into the world and you create in your body and your neurology, you create your experience of the world. It isn't delivered to you. You sort through it, you edit it, you compile it, you put it together. Just the same way that Bonnard puts a painting together. And all the paintings I like, whether it's Chardin or Corot or Bonnard or, Vuillard and Fairfield Porter, they all have this acknowledgement of the painting being fiction, which ultimately serves as this reminder of your own responsibility, that you put these things together. You put the painting together when you look at it.
Right.
You put you make sense of the Bonnard painting, and you make sense of the world. It's a reminder that you're actively involved in whatever you believe, whatever you think.
Right. Interesting.
That's very different.
Way to look. It is very different. It's a very different way of looking at it.
It's a very different idea from some idea of, an academic painting of three lemons on a shelf that's, so beautifully rendered that you feel like, oh, I'm connected to Velázquez or I'm connected to Chardin because look at how well I can make those lemons appear. But so I don't care like to what extent you take your realism or your representation, but I don't want you to deny the fiction of this painting because I think that is part of its beauty.
Right. And I think too, I mean, I just when I see your paintings, to me, the subject is the color. To me, that's very obvious because you play with it so much, both in the representational aspects of it, and then by just placing these, these little notes of color all over the canvas. And I really enjoy how they interact. And that story of, being in the environment and having something kind of pass by and break into it, to me, is sort of also playing with the moment of painting. So you're out there, and I think people get caught up in trying to paint this scene, for example, that there's,
Sure.
This beautiful Italian countryside. And even though you're painting and you're supposed to be in the moment, a lot of people try to get that scene that is in their head that's in front of them. And if something comes and blocks them, if somebody parks their car, something interrupts that in any way, they want to take that out or work around it. And so I think that's really refreshing to see that it's like, okay, that it's sort of like a moment in time. It's the time that you were there and not just a snapshot.
Sure.
So it's more about the scene and what was happening at that moment, which I think is really, really cool. So when you shifted from painting, I know you painted a lot of plein air painting, and then you moved into the studio, like, you've been talking about that. What sort of shifts were happening in your mind because it sounds like you did a lot of painting outdoors, and then you kind of shifted to almost exclusively in the studio. And I'm curious if that was a reaction, if that was working something out in your work, or if that was just sort of you had exhausted what you were going to do plein air, for example.
Well, I think it's important to understand that I painted when I was a teenager. When I was in school, I think like in 7th, 8th, 9th grade, something like that, is when I started to actually make paintings, like in, art class at school. And then in high school, I would try to make little abstract paintings. I mean, sometimes, like friends would go out on a Friday night, and I'm 17 and I would be like, nah, I'm going to stay home and paint. I mean, it was kind of like, I was a little bit of a loner sometimes, but I would try to make these abstract paintings. I mean, even I remember when I was 17, and I would be so frustrated because I had some very powerful sentiment, and yet whatever the painting was, however exciting it might have been as it was going along, a lot of the time the results were dissatisfying. So although I was painting a lot when I was younger, it wasn't as if anybody was saying, oh, you're doing a great job, or I was feeling like this is meant to be, I'm very good at this. Mm-hmm. There was always lots of frustration. So I paint in college, I paint right after college, and then I go to grad school in New York for 2 years, and we paint from life the whole time that I'm at Parsons in New York. This is like 1988 to 90. And the most natural thing to me, to get more sensitive to color, to get better at painting, to be able to make paintings that I felt like were what I was trying to make, the most natural thing to me seemed to be to go park yourself somewhere with an easel, whether it was in front of a person or out in a landscape, and just paint as much as you could. Mm-hmm. And so I did that for years. But then at some point, I saw all of the colors I'm mixing on the palette, and you're using some of the color in the painting as you're standing there. And then I would go back into my little house in Provence that I'm renting, and I have all this other paint on the palette, and I would just continue inside making these abstract paintings. So there I was painting outside in this very kind of classic, plein air way. And then I'm back inside making abstractions that were not so geometric. They were closer to like kind of early Diebenkorn or de Kooning or something like that. They were much more kind of with like biological shapes and things like that. But so more and more, I'm still painting outside, but I'm painting a lot inside. And then at some point, I really was only painting outside a few weeks a year. And I was lucky to get a big studio. And once I had access to a larger space, then I could start making these big paintings. And then that was it. I just wanted to be inside with those big paintings because I had the room, I could put them out, I could work on them, and I wanted to see them really objectively. And so the moving away from the outside came partly from having done it so much, but it also came from the fact that I wanted to really be able to observe the color. And outside, your eyes are getting flooded with strong light, and whatever's around the painting in the background is impacting the way it looks. I wanted to see the paintings on a big white wall and really see what would happen when I added a gray, or when I added an orange, or when I made a red a little bit different from the red that was already there. And so there was a kind of just like an endless fascination for how the color was changing when it went from my palette over into the world of the painting, that I just wanted to be inside all the time. And I still paint outside now, but it's definitely not, it's not that much,
Right.
Did that make sense again?
That totally made sense. So can I ask you a little bit about how, when you were first starting out, how you managed sort of the business? I don't know if the business side of it is the correct way to term it, but I get a lot of questions from people about how do you sustain this? How do you maintain this when you're at that stage where you're really working hard on the craft, on painting, on getting your time in, and this is something that takes decades. What were you doing to support yourself during that time?
Well, before I answer that, let me just say that I think the most important thing is balance, and selling paintings, trying to be in touch with dealers or trying to visit galleries and things, in some ways can be very social. And I think it can really balance out the solitary time of being in the studio. So I think there's something that's actually pretty nice about being able to interact with someone who bought your painting or trying to sell a painting. And then you have all that quiet time to yourself where you're just painting, and it's kind of like wearing two hats. And I think it's important to try to separate them and to sort of take the benefits of each experience and not to let them get intertwined. And then I also think that the same way you have to solve this problem of who are you as a painter and what does that mean, and what do you draw on to be the kind of painter you want to be, I think there's the same parallel in what is your career going to be? How are you going to deal with galleries? What kind of, I don't know, how available do you want to be to the public? Things like that. So you have to solve this problem of what is your studio life like? And then you also have to solve this problem or come up with an approach or a design or a reality of what is your selling paintings going to be like? What is that world of your dealing with the public going to be like? So they're very similar in the sense you have to decide. You can't say, well, that's how Stuart Schills did it.
Right.
That's how I will do it.
Right.
But you listen to what Stuart said, and it helps you to understand, well, what sounds true about that to me? Not truthful, but what sounds like that's me, and what sounds like, oh, I can't do that. I mean, so you look at other people's careers, you watch what they've done, you spend time figuring out, like a detective, well, how did they get that painting to sell, or how did they get that painting into a museum? And then you say, am I willing to do that? Or does that seem like me? Can I do that? Am I comfortable with that? Okay. So that's kind of my philosophy.
That makes a lot of sense.
And then now sort of the nuts and bolts is that when I was in college, I took art history and painting and drawing, but I also studied math and computer science. And I was able to work for like 2 years when I first came out of undergrad and go to art school at night every day. And so I quit my job when I was 24 to go to grad school for painting. And I didn't do computer work or anything like that when I was in grad school. I did like house painting or, labor where you can get a bunch of cash and then you can, save, like kind of like Stuart was talking about. You go paint a whole lot of houses. I'd paint houses for 6 weeks and then I'd go to France for 2 months, something like that with all the money and, live cheaply and just paint. So I did that in my 20s. And then in my 30s, or in my late 20s, I actually was lucky enough to be in some shows with some pretty good galleries. And, this is the pre-internet days. So this is the old gallery world. Right. This is the old gallery world, the old gallery model where galleries are nice to you and you're nice to them and you give them a painting and they sell the painting and they pay you. And the guy who bought the painting can't even find you if he wanted to.
Right.
So it's pretty straightforward, right? And it's much more complex now. But I did that for a while. And I was also lucky that I live here in Silicon Valley, where you have people who just want to meet someone and buy the painting. The people in Silicon Valley are very independent. They don't want a dealer to hold their hand. They see a painting on a wall in a restaurant and they just want to know who made it and buy it. Or maybe they want to come to your studio. So here I am in the 90s showing at a great gallery in San Francisco and a good gallery in Los Angeles. And then I actually showed in New York because of those two places. And they're not selling tons of paintings, but they're selling paintings. And I'm getting checks and I'm getting paid. But then there was kind of a perfect storm because my dealer in San Francisco pissed me off because we had a really successful show together and he'd sold a lot of paintings out of the gallery. And it was time for my second show. And you won't have to ask me the hardship question because I'm just going to give it to you. So,
okay.
He came to the studio to talk about my next show, which was scheduled, and it was even like in a contract. And he sees my paintings, and he's like, "Well, wait a second, where are the paintings for the show?" And I said, "Well, these are the paintings." And he said, "But these are really different from that show that practically sold out 2 years ago. And I don't even know if I would have known that these are your paintings." And so he wasn't nasty, but he was surprised. And the next morning I wake up and there's a fax coming out of my fax machine and it says, "We're really sorry, but your show has been postponed for 2 years." And I was like, wow, that sucks, and looking back, I think some of the paintings I showed him may have been a little half baked, and they were definitely not only different from what he had been expecting, but they were pretty broad in the range of what they were exploring. So looking back, I wouldn't fault him at all for canceling it. And so I just went in and I said, "I'm canceling the contract. I need the other paintings back that you still have." And he said, "Whoa, wait a second. I didn't mean like we have to break up. I just meant that your show is delayed for 2 years." And I said, "Well, my show's delayed for 2 years. What, am I supposed to just sit around and paint and just wait for 2 years from now? I have to live, And
right.
So I took my paintings, and there was another gallery that had been calling me for a long time. And I called him and I said, "Guess what? I'm free now." He took some of my new paintings. He took a few of the older ones. And we started to work together, and he sold tons of paintings. And he was a little bit further away from where I live versus the guy in San Francisco who was close by. And so he was further away. We didn't bother each other. He just sold my paintings. And at this point in my life, I didn't need as much money, and I could almost live on I could live on what he was selling. But then years go by, your life gets more expensive, you have kids,
right.
The world becomes more expensive, and the internet comes along. And I was lucky to have my paintings in a restaurant in Palo Alto in the middle of Silicon Valley, and a lot of people started to buy them. And so I'm still showing in New York, and I'm still showing up in Napa, and I'm showing in Palo Alto, and the prices are the same everywhere. So painting sells in Palo Alto, and it's, that's really good. I get the whole thing.
Right.
And so I was living off of my work, and and then, my dealer, the thing in San Francisco fell apart, and then my dealer in New York passed away, and then my dealer in Los Angeles passed away. And the internet is getting appears to be more and more a way of allowing other people to find your work. And so I just kept going with it. I kept painting and doing what I thought was right. And then I just kept trying harder and harder to allow people to bump into my paintings. I didn't try to figure out what do people want. I tried to figure out how can I get my paintings out there so that people who like what I'm doing know about it. And if Eric Fischel can sell a painting for $400,000, why can't I sell a painting for $40,000? I don't think it's unrealistic.
Right.
And so I did a lot of maverick things. I ran ads in the New York Times. I have done things that I don't know anybody else has ever done, and they've worked.
Right. Okay, so there's a couple of things. One that I think is important for the listeners to hear out of that is, and it might seem kind of inconsequential to you, but I think that there's sometimes this idea that there's this hierarchy of where you show your art, and that restaurants are, beneath you, or that if you're not in a gallery, you know what I mean? That showing your work in a restaurant isn't like... But
let me say something. It's like I have all these catalogs that I print when I have shows, or in the past I have printed, and I came up with an idea that they could be inserted into the New York Times on Sundays. because the New York Times is distributed in zones around the country. And so I could print a catalog and have it inserted into the New York Times just in Northern California. Mm-hmm. So just within, like a 70-mile radius of where I live. And that was very lucrative. I did that. And it was very lucrative. And I remember when I was printing this catalog with my printer in Arizona, and she would always say, well, I hope this one works. I hope that catalog doesn't get lost in there with all those other inserts, from like Costco and Safeway. And I was like,
they won't.
I was like, you don't get it. There aren't any other inserts. This is not the Tucson Traveler. This is the New York Times. And this is the only thing that will be in there. And when she would say things like that to me, I just realized that when I get a hunch like this, I have to follow it. I can't listen to anybody else's advice about it because they don't see it the way I see it. It's like, look, this morning I'm going for a run. Before we did this interview, I went out for my morning run and I see like a piece of a car fender that got ripped off in an accident, and there's a big old jagged screw sticking out of it. And I see that thing and I just think, that's either going to end up in my tire or it's going to end up in somebody else's tire. I need to pick that up. And so I pick it up and I throw it away after my run. And the same way that I see that screw and I see it going into somebody's tire, I see the insert from somebody else in my New York Times, and I think I should put my insert in the New York Times. Mm-hmm. I don't put a lot of effort into it. I see these connections, mm-hmm. and I'm grateful for that ability. I see them. I don't really try. Mm-hmm. And then I try things that are pretty maverick or pretty crazy. I mean, a lot of people wouldn't spend $50 to make their own postcard when the gallery won't do it. And I'll spend $5,000 to make my own catalog when the gallery won't do it. And then you have that catalog. But, if you talk to a lot of people, you can be Frank Stella having a show at a small museum in Philadelphia, and the museum isn't doing anything. And then you go to the show and there's this beautiful book on Frank Stella's work. And he did that.
Right.
He printed that. He got the writer that he really likes and knows to write about his work, and he printed the book and he oversaw it and he made sure the design was nice and that the photographs looked good. And maybe the museum did it in New York, but the museum in Philly didn't do it. He did it. So there's a lot of things like that happening in the art world that you might think are happening in a way that they're not.
Exactly.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it's exactly. And I think, I hear, so from all these interviews that I'm doing, what I pick up on is I hear a lot of artists who tell me that, similar to what you just said, in a way that, well, I don't know how I see these things. I just, I see them and it makes sense to me, so I do them. And I think, honestly, I think you should give yourself more credit than that this is something that you think about, that you're continually thinking about in maverick ways or other ways. Like, how can I get my artwork in front of the right people? And I think what is refreshing is that a lot of artists are afraid to steer their own bus. They want somebody else to drive it for them. And I think it's really refreshing to see somebody who gets behind the wheel and says, this is my bus. I'm steering it. It's going to go where I want it to go.
That's a very good way to put it, because I tell my son sometimes there's two kinds of people in the world. There's people who want to take care of themselves, and there's people who want to be taken care of. And it's really okay either way. But I think it's worth recognizing maybe which group you fit into. And believe me, if some of my relationships with my gallery in New York or gallery in San Francisco had been more sustainable, and if the dealer didn't pass away or something, I could have gone down a different road. But there were definitely some things pushing me into these choices, things that weren't working out or weren't working out well enough. And I do think that some people have this kind of old-fashioned relationship, if you will, with the gallery, where the gallery's interest is really long-term, just like the artist. Mm-hmm. And they go hand in hand along this path for 20 or 30 years. But if the gallery's interest is not long-term, it's kind of a strange combination, because your interest is long-term. Mm-hmm. You're doing this for your life. Mm-hmm. You're going to do this until you drop dead. You're not going to retire. You're going to do this until you drop dead. And if you have 10 amazing paintings in a show, and the show didn't go that well in the sense that it didn't sell, it didn't get a review, that doesn't really mean anything. It just means that the gallery couldn't find the right people. It doesn't mean that your paintings aren't great. It doesn't mean that they're not sincere. It doesn't mean that they're not worth keeping. Maybe you'll sell all of them in 4 years for even more than the gallery was trying to sell them. So the gallery wants to now, call back all these people who are interested and didn't buy and say, guess what, the show's over. Let me give you 10 or 20% off, because they want to get rid of the paintings.
Mm-hmm. You
want to keep the paintings. You're 35 years old. You're 40 years old. You want to own those paintings when you're 80 because you believe in them and they're a part of you, and they're only going to look better in 40 years. They're only going to be more important in 40 years. So take them back and take care of them and keep them.
What do you do what do you do with your paintings that you're?
Well, I actually have paintings that are put away for my son. I have paintings that are put away just because I want to keep them. Mm-hmm. I have also paintings that come back from a show and I see them a bit more clearly and I rework them. There's something I want to change. Or it's not even that I want to change something, but I see a chance to grow from something in the painting where it could go in another direction. Mm-hmm. And so I might be happy to get some of them back in the sense that I want to rework them. One of my teachers, Leland Bell, who was my teacher at Parsons in New York, had paintings that would come back from shows, and he was notorious for changing them. He even had a big poster from his exhibit at the Phillips Collection in Washington, D.C., and it was on his wall in his studio, and he would repaint the poster. He would repaint areas like of some, buddy's arm or dress in the poster of his painting, because he was so curious to see, well, what if I tweak that red a little bit, or I tweak that green? And I just think that it's all very open-ended. Just like your painting and your life in the studio is open-ended, and your career in the art world is open-ended too. And, believe me, I understand that excitement and that even that satisfaction, of somebody coming in your studio and buying the painting, or the gallery getting a review or publicity for your show. I mean, I'm not saying that doesn't do something to you, but that's really not what it's about. I mean, your relationship with your work is the only thing that you can really count on, and that this is really about. But given that that's so important and you want your freedom, then wouldn't it be amazing to also get to sell these things that you really need to make?
Yeah.
So that's the way I see it, is I'm selling things. Fortunately, I'm selling things that I really need to make and really want to make, and probably would be insane if I didn't make. Uh-huh. And it's some strange coincidence that other people want them.
Right. Do you think, so you touched on this a little bit, and this is something I'm starting to ask people because I'm getting more and more curious about this. I did an interview with Tom Woodall, who's an artist from Los Angeles, and I studied with him for a long time, and he kind of put something into words that I hadn't really articulated yet, or maybe I didn't want to articulate it yet. But I'm curious, since you mentioned that, there was a time when you were able to live off of the sales of your painting, and your life was different then because, you were able to live off of less. Do you think it is possible for an artist to live solely off of the sale of their paintings?
Well, I've been doing that for the last 10 years.
Just off the sales?
Yes. Yeah.
So then the answer is yes. I'm curious because it seems like a unicorn out there that and I'm wondering if that's what it is. That
No. I think you look at I don't know if you know the gallery Laurie Bookstein in New York, but that's where John Dubrow shows, and I like his work a lot. And
I love his work.
He lives on the sale of his paintings. I mean, and believe me, I think it's a little bit rare, but I could probably list 10 people. I don't really want to do that, but I could, okay. I could list them. And I think there's absolutely a way to do it. I think when it's working, that you never feel very relaxed or comfortable. I mean, you really enjoy it, but it can be very stressful in the sense that you wonder, like, can it continue? Right. There's always this apprehension that I think it's kind of like people who get a good acting role, probably in a film or a TV show or something, and they're just so well aware that there's other people who are really good and somehow not getting the role. And so I'm well aware of these other painters who I think are doing wonderful work. And I hate to say, like, in the sense it's not selling or it's not selling enough, but in my mind, it's simply that the right people are not experiencing the work. They're not seeing it and then, connecting with it and collecting it. And I think it really is this issue of, have you found the people? Because I really think there's an audience for everyone, and you just have to be fortunate enough to find them.
Do you think it's fortune? Or do you think that there's an active, I guess,
you mean
there's
like an energy or like a force? Or...
the vibe that you ask the universe. No. I guess there's kind of two ways to phrase it, I guess. What do you think the biggest mistakes are that people make that aren't doing that? Or what are people who are able to do it doing differently? Maybe that's a better way to put it. What do they do differently?
I wonder if the people who are selling the paintings look at the whole picture differently. I wonder if they see what's going on in a different way instead of... I mean, you definitely don't want to think, okay, my painting is so amazing that somebody's got to knock on the door and find me and then therefore want to buy the painting. I can't believe how when you try to invite someone to an opening or to an art talk, that you give in a museum or something like that, oh my God, it's crazy. I mean, these people that you're trying to invite are being invited by 1,000 other people to do 30 different things in that 1 month, and you're trying to get them to come to your show, trying to get them to look at your new book or your new catalog. And it's not personal at all. It's just people are completely overwhelmed and completely maxed out, and so that can really work against you. And so there's an aspect of it that you have to be fortunate enough to be there at the right time when people have their eyes open and their hearts open and have a few minutes. And, back in the late 80s, early 90s, I think when the galleries in Santa Fe were doing so well, a lot of people talked about how so many of the people who were buying paintings in Santa Fe were coming there, like affluent people, discerning people from New York or Boston or Miami coming to Santa Fe, and they were at leisure for a week. And they were walking around and they were going in the galleries. And there was, if you think about it, like they're falling in love, right? Mm-hmm. And then normally they have no time. It doesn't matter who's in front of them, whether it's, Ray Fiennes or Cindy Crawford, whoever's in front of them, it's just, they're not going to see them.
Right.
And then you go to Santa Fe and you have this time and you see somebody and you just fall for them. And that, you see a painting and you fall for it and you buy it. And it becomes about that moment where nobody was pursuing you. You were just hanging out and you fell for something. And there's a beautiful thing where it's just happening, there's a serendipity to it. And I think that's why all those galleries did so well in Santa Fe. And a lot of people were saying, this is what needs to happen. You don't want to have a gallery in New York trying to get all these people to come in for an opening on Thursday with a whole lot of lawyers and watch everybody buy a painting. And then you have to get one too. There was a thing about people allowing a more organic experience to happen. Mm-hmm. And I think that still happens sometimes, but I don't know to what extent it happens with, somebody stumbling into your painting on a website or on Facebook or on something like that, because it's too noisy, Mm-hmm. I do think it happens a little bit, but I don't think it happens a lot.
Yeah, I don't know. If I had to guess, I would guess that, up to a certain point, it probably happens. But if you're, like your work or, you mentioned Eric Fischl, a painting at that level, I don't know if you're going to buy it off of Facebook, for example.
No, yeah. Well, I mean, I think somebody who wants to buy an Eric Fischl wants to fly to New York and go to Mary Boone and have somebody kind of treat them like shit and then have this New York experience and then they write a big check for it. I think that's a very authentic thing. They go to like 20 galleries while they're hanging out in New York for a weekend, and then they decide, I'm going to buy the Fischl, and I don't have one yet.
Right.
And it's, I don't really like Fischl's paintings, so don't ever think that I do. And,
I will duly note that.
Yeah, there was, I can really tell you stories about galleries that would really discourage you. But on some level, I think the gallery relationship is really great and could be really great. But
I think you have to find the right one, right?
Have to, absolutely. You have to find the right one. And, I know what I wanted to say. I think younger people, sometimes they're not really thinking, all right, here, you said, well, what is it? What are they missing out on? Think about this. You put a lot of effort into finding a gallery. You live in Seattle and there are 20 galleries. if you've put effort into it, you've seen that maybe you might only fit into 2 of those 20 galleries. So don't bombard all 20 of them with your desire to show with them. And, go to the other 2. But keep in mind that the gallery isn't sitting there waiting for you to walk in the door. No matter how good your paintings are, no matter how much they might fit in, no matter how much you might be the right match for them, they are there day to day, getting ready for the next show, dealing with the artists they already represent, trying to sell paintings, trying to advertise. They're completely swamped. They're already there, installed in this whole process that you want to insert yourself into. And you need to find a way to gently insert yourself or gently get your work in front of them so that they can have an organic experience of saying, oh, okay, I want to know more about that. I want to meet that person. I want to see their work in the studio or something. So keep in mind that they're not waiting for you to show up.
Yeah. I think it's really important to understand where, put yourself in the mind of the gallery and understand where they're at and meet them there. Because, you want to get into a gallery, but it's not all about you. And especially at that moment when you're reaching out to a gallery, it's not about you. It's all about them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think you have to also go in with the mindset that this is going to be great if this works. This is going to make me feel much better day to day. And yet you have to also wear this energy of, but I'm going to make the paintings that I want to make. And I am who I am. And I'm not looking for you as a dealer or you as a gallery to validate what I'm doing or to even help me figure out what to do next. I think you have to walk this line of having a kind of humility, but also a kind of a confidence. Look, it's like dating. God forbid you're making all these paintings that they want and they fall in love with you, but that wasn't who you were.
Mm-hmm.
And then where are you now? So be yourself. You got to be yourself and you got to work hard and you got to try things. And then you have to be sensitive to other people's situations.
Mm-hmm. Great advice. Love that. Tell me, we made, without me asking, we made it through all the questions that I wanted to ask. That's fantastic.
I think we covered it. Yeah.
We did. So here's a question there's 2 more questions that I'd like to ask people. If you could give yourself, the artist that you were 10 years ago, one piece of advice, what would it be?
I'm not sure that I would do anything different in the sense that I would send any advice back. I think I always struck a pretty good balance between being a little overconfident in the sense that it protected me, mm-hmm. and being available enough and pushy enough with the gallery, but maybe not too pushy that I was so annoying that they wouldn't want to work with me. So I don't know. I drew as much as I could. I read as much about color as I could, and I painted as much as I could. And I think I struck a pretty good balance. I went through some adversities, and I think I made pretty good responses to them. So, looking back, I don't think I would change anything.
That's a great place to be in.
And believe me, it was definitely full of bumps in the roads and problems. But as much as they were making me crazy, I think I always struck a balance and found my way through them. They really sucked when they were happening. Like when I would I'd lost a studio and then I had to find a new one. And that was absolutely horrible. But I got through it, Yeah,
it sounds like you are a very level-headed person and isn't easily swayed by good things or bad things. And that allows you to be objective enough to pull what you need out of any situation or to learn from it and move on.
Yeah, I try. Believe me, I go to the studio and I'm full of anxieties or frustrations and I worry about my son's future and things like everybody. I don't always tell everybody that, but I have all that restlessness and that anxiety. But I paint and that's how I deal with it more than by talking about it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think that's common with artists.
Yeah.
If you could own a piece of art by any living artist, what would it be or whose?
I'm not really coveting anybody's work. I might be curious to have a painting by Thomas Nikowski, I think it is, who shows with Pace in New York. I think I said that right. that's partly because I really wonder what it would be like to live with one of his paintings, because his paintings are very coveted, and I think they're very interesting and mysterious. But I wonder what it would be like to actually get to look at one, over and over again. But much more than that, I would love to own a Pissarro painting from the 1870s, like Pissarro's paint. There's a Pissarro painting called The Fence, which is in the National Gallery of Art in DC. And it was here temporarily in San Francisco for the summer, and I got to see it here. And it's in my new book. It's reproduced in my new book because I made this massive abstract painting that's kind of based off of this Pissarro painting. And so I would definitely turn down the Tom painting to have the Pissarro painting. Yeah.
How many books do you have out? I counted 12 on Amazon.
Well, there's 3 hardback books. And then there's a lot of gallery catalogs or exhibition catalogs, but there's 3 hardback books, and the newest hardback book only came out recently, and it's a massive book. It's 288 pages, and it has, in the heart of the book, right in the middle, there's a section where there's a Giorgio Morandi on the left-hand side and a Joseph Albers on the right-hand side, and it kind of recreates that exhibit that I saw in Bologna that was so important for my work, that it's been discussed, in interviews and things like that. I always bring it up, but it was beautiful to have it in the book to try to give credit, to this thing that happened to me, and also to allow somebody else possibly have that, make that same connection between their work. I think Albers is really dismissed as being very intellectual, but he's incredibly sensitive and spiritual, and his paintings, they don't really make sense when you only know 1 or 2 of them, because you go to every museum and they have a Joseph Albers, and there it is, one of them, and then there's the Jasper Johns, and then there's the Frank Stella, and it's just sort of like, yes, we have a Joseph Albers, but when you see a collection of his work or you spend enough time with it, it's just like the Morandis, because the Morandi still life means so much more when you've seen 100 others.
Right.
And the Joseph Albers means so much more when you've seen 100 others, and you start to realize that nesting of colors is, like the sun versus concrete versus water versus plant, that they are all drawn from life experience. As much as they might be kind of called abstract, they're incredibly based on observation and feeling. And he's completely misunderstood. The only advice I would give to anybody who's painting and wants to know more about color, or to be more sensitive to color, is I would say stick it out and actually read Interaction of Color, because it's a very dense book. It's a very lofty book.
It's hard to get there, but it's brilliant.
But it's there. It's all there. The whole thing is about your whole experience is context. And so given that context is driving all of our conclusions, it must really be playing a big role in whatever we think about color. And I mean, so somebody would say, well, big deal. So how do you base a color lesson or a course off of that? But I mean, it's just very broad. It's a huge, broad philosophy that impacts every moment of anything you try to teach someone about color. Mm-hmm. But the whole book, I mean, it's fantastic. You have to read it almost like poetry, and just go read like a paragraph or a few lines. And then, so I would say read Interaction of Color. And then if you really want to work with color in your work, in your painting, I don't think you can separate hue and value. You have to see hue and value in the same second. You can't separate them.
That goes against what so many people teach.
Yeah, but I don't think you can, because I think that it's like saying somehow that yellow exists somewhere without something around it. Because no matter where your piece of yellow is, whether that yellow is on your palette, in your painting, in your head, wherever it is, it never exists in isolation. So if you were to say the value of something or the hue of something, it doesn't make any sense. I mean, that's what Albert's saying, is because it always exists somewhere at some moment with something else around it, either impacting it or taking away from it or defining it. Mm-hmm. So you look at Fairfield Porter, you look at Milton Avery, And you see that there's no distinction between hue and value. It's true that that any color in the painting may behave as a darker or lighter versus something else, but it never does that free of its hue or independent of its hue.
Interesting. I'm going to go back. I'm going to look at it with that in my head.
But even Corot does that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually, if you go back to Corot, and there's an argument for this in my book, the new book, Color as Content. There's a visual argument from all these different painters who I've lined up images of their work. Everything goes back to Corot. Mm-hmm. I was having this argument with the painter Shangram Manjumdar in New York, and I was saying, Shangram's younger than me, and I was like, Shangram, I'm sorry, but I'm a little older than you, and trust me that Corot is the source of everything. Vuillard, Monet, Pissarro, all of it goes back to Corot, and it all goes back to him because even though he's using a brown or a tan or a gray or a red or a black or a white, he doesn't distinguish between them. When he uses them, they behave as a color and a value at the same moment. He does not make value paintings. His contemporaries did. Mm-hmm. But the reason he's so important and the reason that Corot impacted so many people is because he was the first person that really did that.
Interesting.
And that's what makes his work so complex.
Right.
So much more than some kind of period piece.
Right. Have you seen, there's a Joseph Albers, The Theory of Color app. It's basically the book that they put out, but you can play with his experiments. Have you ever seen that?
You know, I know about it, and I haven't used it yet. I know that they did that, and I remember that they were going to do it, and maybe they did it once, and it didn't quite work, and then they did a better job, but I have not used it. I haven't used it yet. But I'm a little surprised they did that, because one of the things that he's getting across is that even when you look at the giant original version of Interaction of Color, where you see the color plates, he points out that this plate here, this page 44 plate, which is discussing this idea of warm and cool in color, he says, be careful. This plate will not work inside unless there's adequate light. Mm. Or if you go outside and the volume of light is so great, it may not work. In the sense that, again, that's the whole point, is that you have to have an awareness of the context. So therefore, the computer screen is not. It's true that on the computer screen you could take a gray that would become red when it's surrounded by green, and you could take the same gray and you could make that reddish gray become green by surrounding it by red, because the outside color subtracts from it. Mm-hmm. So you can do that, which is a big part of Albers, but yet you miss out on this other thing that comes up just by experiencing the physical book.
Yeah. And then the other experience of creating those yourself, of mixing the paint and making it happen right in front of you, that's another.
Oh yeah, because when you mix that color, it educates your entire being about that color, not just your brain, not just your eyes. It's like if I mix the color and I show my son something that's mind blowing, and I show him, he sort of is like, wow, oh, cool. And then if I let him mix the color, and then he touches it and sees it change because he moved it, the physical involvement with the color, and then the shift that the color makes. Yeah. And then he looks at me and he's like, oh my God.
The eyes get like saucers, yeah.
And it's funny because I'll go sometimes and talk to his class or talk to somebody about color, and you show them how one color could have three faces, and they're kind of like, big deal. But if you somehow can allow them to make those three faces appear, which is what Albers' course does, it makes you physically experience the change. It's mind-blowing, because then it makes you realize that when you walk down the street and you saw somebody and you thought that was Helene, but it was really Mary, you suddenly crack this door in your body and your brain that, wow, I might be actually getting a lot of things wrong, because I don't know if it was Helene or Mary. I made up my mind that it was one or the other, and I actually could have been wrong. Like, right. You realize that all day, Mary didn't tell you I'm Mary. You decided, and it might have been Helene. And I'm not trying to be all, new agey or anything. But this is very true that, I mean, you are making all these conclusions, and yet you don't have the control to ever see that it might not have been what you thought. And Albers's course opens that window onto your own self-awareness. Mm-hmm. So it's like meditation. It's like Zen practice. It's like enlightenment. It is so broad. It is so universal. The lessons of that experience, of this color course, they apply to everything in your life. It is not just about painting or design. It's about your whole experience with the world. Wow, I said a lot. Probably...
Mind blowing. I love it.
Yeah.
I want to go back and read it now. I just, that wonder and that amazement that you described with your son is, I remember that so clearly. The first 2 color theory classes that I took, and we started studying him and mixing the paint and doing that, and that just, it was like magic. I don't know how else to describe it. It's like magic. It's just mind blowing.
Well, sometimes I'll show people like how you can take one color and sort of make it look bluish here, and then maybe it looks reddish here, and then it looks greenish over there, and then they're kind of like, well, big deal. And I said, so you would agree this is a gray blue, and then this is a gray red, and this is a gray green, and they're like, yes, no problem. And then I say, well, so which is the name that you would give it?
Right.
And then they kind of look at me like, woo, okay, now I can't. That's kind of a problem. So maybe Helene and Mary are the same person, and they have 2 names. And
right. You just think you see them.
Yeah.
Based on where they're standing, because you expect her to be in that place. It's
Exactly. Right. Your brain jumps to a conclusion all the time because there isn't enough time available. So it's constantly jumping down the road. That T is missing from the stop sign, and it doesn't even notice because it just said that was a stop sign. You didn't actually look at the letters. You identified it. Really looking is very different from saying that you know what was there. Yeah. And that's what students struggle with. My teacher, Ray Berry, in college, I said to him, this painting thing really matters to me. This is really taking hold of me. What should I do over the summer? What can I do? You must have something you can tell me to do to keep going on my own that's going to make a difference. And he said, just look. And he said, just look, really open your eyes and really look. And I had another teacher who said, it's all there. You look at the still life, every answer, every nuance of color, everything you need to know is in the still life. You just cannot see very well because you're 22 instead of 52,
Right.
And when you're 52, you will see very differently.
Right. You're constantly seeing differently because of every experience you had and all the lenses that you put on from where you grew up to where you currently live to where you've traveled or not traveled. And it's really, I mean, I think listening and looking are very difficult things when you can say that we're having this conversation and I'm listening to you, but it's, this is what I'd love about doing these interviews but it's also really hard is I'm like really, really listening, like really focusing to the point where when we finish this call, when we stop, I'm exhausted and I just go lay down for a while because I'm really trying to be there and be present. And I think when you're painting, it's a similar thing that if you're not paying attention, your mind wanders. If you're not really, really focused, you see what you think you're going to see and you don't see what's actually there.
Absolutely. That's right. I totally agree. And we have limitations. We only have so much energy and neurology. So, when you're texting in the car, the reason you don't see that person that you almost hit is because nothing is going to your eyes to allow you to watch them.
Right.
Because you've used that whatever limited amount of resource that you have. It's all going into your texting and your hands on the steering wheel, and there's no visual available. So you go to the museum and you're texting in the museum and then you're talking to somebody. You can't even see the painting that well. I see all these people looking at paintings, talking, texting, taking photos, and I really wondered, have they even seen a single painting?
Probably not. No, not really. I mean, they glanced and they saw what they thought they were going to see, a painting on the wall, and noticed that it was red.
Yeah, they ID'd, that was a Monet. Like they can go to coffee in the cafe afterwards and they can say, yes, I saw a Pissarro, I saw a Monet. I saw Chuck Close. But if you ask them to describe any of those paintings, they probably couldn't.
Yeah, yeah. Or God, when you go to the Louvre and you see the Mona Lisa, it is so depressing to me because there's the Mona Lisa, it's behind this thick plate of glass, and there's an enormous crowd around it, and everybody's trying to take pictures of it, and nobody's looking at it. Nobody can see it. Nobody's it's just a prop to say that they were there.
It's sad.
It's so sad.
Something is sad. And actually, that's perfect that you said the Louvre, because the only advice I would give myself going back is that I would have gone to the Louvre more often and gone to the Salon de Corot upstairs. Mm-hmm. There's one of the wings is called Sully, and upstairs in the Sully section, there's the room where all the Corot paintings are, and it's usually pretty mellow. And to me, if you want to know about painting, you want to get better at painting, you want to understand where any painting comes from, whether it's a Matisse or a Fischl or anything that's being done. You go to that Corot room and you draw from those paintings, and it will answer all the questions. And that Pissarro painting that I wanted to own, the fence, it's only because of Corot that painting exists, I think. So
very cool.
And that's a good place to wrap up all of my I've said enough nonsense now. So. That
is not nonsense. Mitchell, thank you so much. We've had a very long, deep conversation. I really appreciate you spending the time with me and agreeing to talk to me. Thank you.
Yeah, that was very rich and very fun. I appreciate it, and thanks for asking me to do this.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for listening to this episode, and a big thank you again to Mitchell for such a great conversation. And as always, links to everything that we talked about are in the show notes at savvypainter.com/37. So let me know what you've learned from this episode. I would love to hear from you. I've been having a lot of great chats with some listeners lately, so if you have anything you want to bring up, go to savvypainter.com/37 and leave a comment there. Also, I just want to say I am so grateful for the reviews some of you have left for me on iTunes. If you'd like to help Savvy Painter out and you've been enjoying the podcast, please leave a review on iTunes. That helps me get great guests on the show. All you have to do is go to savvypainter.com/iTunes. You'll be taken directly to the page to leave a review. And while you're there, hit the subscribe button so you don't miss an episode. Until next week, this is Antrese Wood with the Savvy Painter Podcast. Thanks so much for listening.